Today's episode of the Counselling Tutor Podcast is sponsored by Web Healer. You're a counsellor in private practice and you need a website, or you've got an existing website which you need help with. Web Healer are offering Counselling Tutor Podcast listeners, that's you, £100 off the cost of a website design and build. Now, Web Healers specialize in websites for counselors and psychotherapists. It's what they do. And the Web Healer team provide a completely non-technical, done-for-you solution, leaving you to focus your time on your clients. Operating for 20 years, Web Healer are a trusted resource amongst counselors when it comes to getting your practice online. So get the package details and claim your £100 off coupon for your new website by going to counsellingtutor.com/website. That's counsellingtutor.com/website.
Hi, I'm Rory and welcome to episode 321 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Today's guest is Phil Mitchell, who you may remember from episode 296. Phil is back to share insights from two powerful lectures he has recorded for the Counsellor CPD Library. In his first lecture, Phil examines the negative messages society often sends out about masculinity and explores ways to foster more positive and empowering perspectives. In his second lecture, he offers practical strategies for engaging male clients more effectively in therapeutic settings. If you'd like to revisit Phil's earlier insights, head over to counsellingtutor.com, click on the podcast tab, and then listen to episode 296. And with that, I'll hand it over to you, Ken.
Welcome to the Counselling Tutor Podcast, the must-listen-to podcast for counsellors, psychotherapists, and counselling students. Here are your hosts, Rory Oakes and Ken Kelly.
Hello and welcome to episode 321 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast with myself, Ken Kelly, and of course, Rory Oakes, who has beautifully introduced today's episode. And we're going to be having three stops on today's journey, starting with ethical, sustainable practice, where today we're looking at effective online counselling for neurodivergent clients. So this is anything that is done via technology. So that includes telephones as well. And this continues our discussion into neurodivergence and how we might welcome neurodivergence into our practice. We then go into Practice Matters. It's an interview, as Rory has already outlined, with Phil Mitchell, and this is Counselling Boys and Men, a beautiful discussion linked to a two-part lecture in our lecture library, but we'll tell you more about that when we get to it. And of course, Student Services today, where we recognise you are students on your formal journey. We're going to be diving into managing boundaries. That's been a topic in the Facebook group for a little while now. So we're going to be putting some light on that. So stick around for that one, because I think that applies no matter where you are in your counselling career, whether a student or qualified. Boundaries are something we manage all the time. But let's start off with that ethical, sustainable practice, continuing that discussion about neurodivergence or neurodiversity in its fullest, looking at all the different aspects of that, Rory. And we're talking today specifically about maybe having a counselling session or welcoming a neurodivergent counsellor into an online setting, whether that be online via a video application or via a telephone or via text or email. So using technology, what do we need to know? Is it different, Rory?
Well, yeah, and I think the first thing we have to acknowledge is the rise of the online world since 2020. For those of us who are looking back and can remember, we had obviously the COVID epidemic, and what happened was that online and telephone counselling went from quite a niche activity to an essential activity through those lockdowns. Then it became part of a very mixed economy of offering to clients. It's become, for want of a better word, part of the mainstream. And as we know, online counselling is very different to face-to-face in that there are mechanisms and psychological processes which we need to look at and to consider, and safety aspects. But also perhaps something that slid under the radar a little bit in the online world is that people who are neurodivergent may be may have specific needs that need to be addressed to be able to have online and telephone counselling or text-based counselling. And we've talked in other podcasts about reasonable adjustments, making sure the room is safe and welcoming for those people who are neurodivergent. And we must focus our attention into the same areas when we're working online. And one of the very interesting things that I found when doing some research for our autism course, I'm sure Ken will speak a little bit more about that as we go along, was some research by Howard and Sedgwick in 2021. So very, very new research, relatively new research. And one of the things that they came across after speaking with neurodivergent clients in medical settings was that a good proportion of those who are neurodivergent, and we're really talking specifically those with autism, didn't like using the phone. They really didn't like the phone and found it a barrier to reaching services. So I guess that's a bit of a salutary lesson and solid information for those who are offering online and telephone counselling. You know, for some people, the phone may not be the best medium, and that's something we really need to take into account when we're doing our contracting or our initial meeting, or even meeting our clients first time on listings or websites, Ken.
Thank you, Rory. Yes. So you started this off by saying, you know, we all kind of now know online working using video applications or using telephone or text-based counselling or email counselling, as it were. There's many different ways to use technology. Is a specialist area. It's now a specialist area that there is a massive uptake on that, as you've kind of introduced there, Rory. I want to say, you know, if you're working online, the first thing, with no matter who your client base is the formal training of online working. Mm-hmm. So pre-COVID, there was no formal online or technology training in core counselling training. And what I mean by that is you're at university or in a college and you're learning and you're studying to become a counsellor. Very unlikely pre-COVID that you would have covered the topic of working online in any way, shape or form. If you did cover it, it would be just a brief touch on it. That has changed. So the curriculum has changed to focus on the fact that there is an online element or a technology element. The ethical bodies have adapted their recommendations and their best practice guides for how we should work. The BACP here in the United Kingdom have issued a curriculum of what you should study, what topics and areas you need to understand to be able to work online. It is not the same as face-to-face. So that is the precursor to this, is when you have training in online and telephone counselling, then you look to invite a neurodivergent audience for that use of that technology in counselling. Then there are additional considerations. So certain things are magnified. Certain things are also considered perhaps easier when working with a neurodivergent audience using online. So you've mentioned, Rory, that that there is research that suggests that perhaps telephone does not suit many autistic individuals. That's not all autistic individuals. I can relate to that. I don't like the phone. I very rarely answer my phone. I let it rather go through to voicemail, and then I'll look what the voicemail is, and then I'll pick up a different form of communication to carry on the conversation with that person. What I don't like about phone conversation, and this is just for me personally, is the immediacy of it. That person speaks now and I have to answer immediately, and sometimes I need time to think and I need time to process before I'm able to answer. And it is maybe for this reason that that written communication for many, and not all, neurodivergent clients is a preferred way of communicating. So it might be asynchronous email communication, where there is time to think and process before answering. Or if we recognize the immediacy of the online environment, we might put in reasonable adjustments. One of those reasonable adjustments might be that if we are communicating via telephone or an online video platform, and we've checked out with that neurodivergent client that they're happy to meet on that platform, that more time is given for them to think about their answer and kind of come back with what they want to share. So more pauses might be a reasonable adjustment that we may look at. We may have neurodivergent clients, and this is not just applicable to neurodivergent clients. This is broader than that. We may have clients who wish not to show themselves on a video platform. They may wish to use an avatar, or they may wish to use a picture of either themselves or just an inanimate object and just work with voice. Now, this can be really helpful for that neurodivergent individual because they don't have to try to maintain eye contact. You know, I was just reading in our Facebook group this morning, Rory, in the Counselling Tutor Facebook group, somebody suggesting, you know, they're really trying hard as a counsellor to have that eye contact when they're working online, and they've got their little window of the video platform they're using right in the corner where their camera is to kind of simulate that the eye contact as best we can get it. Well, as we've discussed in previous episodes, eye contact can be a challenge for neurodivergent individual. This I'm looking at you and you're looking at me and we're facing one another. We've spoken about reasonable adjustments in person within the room where we might turn the chairs away from each other. Well, if you think about video platforms, they're basically, most of them will put two passport photos of each other, yes, basically sat by his side. And in a way, you kind of feel that you're looking into the eyes of that person. And that can feel uncomfortable. Maybe a reasonable adjustment is that it's okay for that person to turn off their camera or to use an avatar. And there are certain third-party providers where you can use an avatar that will represent you on the video. But that leads itself to other considerations as well, such as, are they alone in that room? Is there anybody else that can overhear the conversation? Are they in a safe place? So we would need to think around that and maybe have that kind of a discussion before having those conversations. And then I guess the final thought from my side, Rory, is when we do hold online therapy, very often, most often in my experience, you might be seeing a client who is sat down, maybe in a room, maybe on a chair, maybe in an office, in a kitchen, but generally they might be sat down looking at maybe a laptop or a phone and interacting in that way. Well, with a neurodivergent individual, they may feel safer in a dark room. They may feel safer lying down with the blanket over them. And I guess, Rory, if I was your client and you'd seen me a few times before and I had not shared that I was neurodivergent, but one day when we had our meeting online, I was lying in bed, you might have questions around that, but we would be looking differently if it was a neurodivergent client that we were working with, Rory.
Yes, I mean, I think one of the things that we're beginning to understand is that the way we're taught and our ideas of traditional therapy, I'm kind of inverting commas in the air here now, where we have two people in a room looking at each other, it probably now isn't a good fit for certain types of client. And you've alluded very strongly to neurodivergent clients. It can also be clients who are really struggling with trauma as well. It doesn't have to be neurodivergent clients. And what we have to think about is meeting the clients where they are. So, it may very well be that traditionally when you meet a client online, and you switch the video on and they're lying in bed, that might be very, very uncomfortable for the therapist, because it's like, well, this isn't what we do. We usually turn up and we're usually sat in seats. We usually look at each other. I think that kind of thinking needs to be re-examined, because a lot of neurodivergent people, or some neurodivergent people, they have a strong reaction to bright lights. So we might see them in dimly lit rooms. It might be there's a sensory consideration that the client feels safer if they're under a blanket. Now, unless you know about how neurodivergent people interact with the world, if you don't know this, then it can feel a little different as a therapist. But as you say, knowledge is a great thing, and giving a client choice is a kind of a strategy to manage not only their sensory considerations, but also how they feel, their own intersubjective sense of self. So, I would think that nowadays, those who are working online may have some kind of conversation within their website or their listings about how they work with neurodivergent clients. What speaking directly to them before you've even met the client and saying, it may be that you don't like lights. It may be you prefer not to use the phone. It may be in some situations you may want to have a blanket or just be in bed. It'd be useful for us to talk about this before therapy commences, so I could get a better sense of you. And I think it's all about making your offer clear to the client and making sure that they understand what that you understand as a therapist their frame of reference. And I think eye contact is a classic one, Ken, because in Western societies we're kind of drilled into us from children. Look at me in the eyes. And, if you don't look at someone in the eyes, it's considered untrustworthy or there's something wrong. There's a lot of communities who don't have eye contact. I work with a client who came from Pakistan, and she didn't like eye contact. It was a big struggle for her because her son was at an English school, and the teachers always used to say, "Look me in the eye," and it was quite a challenge. And the same thing happens with neurodivergent clients; they find eye contact uncomfortable. So maybe when we meet clients, we ask some pertinent questions such as, "So how do we meet? How are you with eye contact?" We've discussed about talking about energy levels. It's about setting your practice up for that diversity, which is, of course, neurodiversity, and there is more neurodiverse people being recognised now and recognising themselves as neurodiverse than ever before.
Indeed, it's an important topic, and it's recognising what has it been labelled as, Rory, the hidden generation, or the missed generation? The hidden generation of all those people that may have not been diagnosed and went through their whole life facing all of these challenges and working in a way that welcomes them into our therapy. And what we're doing here is we're building on the formal training foundations, and that's why I started this by saying, it would be hoped that at this stage, anybody working online or with remote technology would have gone and done a comprehensive course in working online to understand things like the disinhibition effect or black hole, or the other psychology that plays out online that maybe doesn't play out in a face-to-face setting. In the same way as we would not expect that somebody might be counselling a neurodivergent client if they hadn't gone and trained to become a counsellor.
Yes.
The same way we would hope that then nobody would be counselling a neurodivergent client, or any client at all, online or using technology if they hadn't done the training and to gain the competences within that area. So we're building on our existing training. And when we're looking at neurodivergence, we're talking about understanding what challenges they may face, how they may show up, what we may see in that, and how we can best welcome them by making reasonable adjustments ourselves with the knowledge that we hold. And one of the areas that is covered extensively in core training to work online or with technology is managing risk in the online setting. And I wonder, Rory, if you could just touch for a moment on how that would differ if we were managing risk in online counselling for an autistic client.
Yes. Well, I mean, the first thing is working online and working in the room are clearly different. If you're working in the room and someone becomes unwell or says that they may be thinking of taking their own life, they're in front of you and you can take action. If someone, bluntly has a heart attack, you phone the ambulance up and they come to your practice rooms and medical aid is given. If you're working with someone online, on a video platform, and you don't know where they are, then it's very difficult to get medical attention to them. And if they were to fall over or have a heart attack or a seizure, you didn't know where they were, you wouldn't be able to give them the help they needed. So making sure that when you work online that you have a contract and you have contact details, emergency contact details, is essential. But specifically, and I think this is a question you're asking me, Ken, about autistic individuals, there is a lot of research now that says that people are autistic, not all, but a substantial majority, have an increased risk of other mental health challenges, including a heightened prevalence of suicide ideation, which is why we must always think about risk management. And it's especially critical. It's sharper in our thinking when we're working with neurodivergent clients. And the way we do that is to review and clearly outline our contract, that we have safety protocols, contact details, and emergency contact information really is recommended. I think that if you just follow the safety protocols of knowing where the client is when you're working online, having contact details, an emergency contact is preferable, maybe someone who knows the client's having counselling, so you can contact them if they become unwell, is going to mitigate risk, because the risk would seem to be higher with those people who, are neurodivergent or on the autistic spectrum. So keeping that very sharply in our mind.
Thank you, Rory. That was beautifully outlined. And, when we're working with a client online, we're going to be looking what their support structure is, who they have around them, and we would do that in face-to-face client as well, mapping a support structure and understanding what that looks like. It is maybe more important if you're working with a neurodivergent individual. There is, within neurodivergence in ADHD and certainly in autism, there can be overwhelm, there can be meltdown, where the person appears to become very agitated, very angry almost in a moment, or not necessarily anger. It can be overwhelm, it can be anxiety, but it comes all at one time, and it can seem like it comes from absolutely nowhere. It may be you're working with a client, that client is neurodivergent, that client hits on a topic or an area within their life, and then suddenly they become overwhelmed by the emotions that come from that. And this is a very realistic scenario that I'm talking about. You would want to already have knowledge of what support structures are in place for that individual. You would want to know what their special interest is, or what the activities are that restore or rejuvenate their points. So if I was working with a client, this is a very, very hypothetical, and maybe that client gained great comfort from their animal. I might, if I saw them getting really agitated or anxious within the session, I might say, I wonder if Tiddles the dog is close by, and can Tiddles come and sit with you now? Or I might say afterwards, you could now go and spend some time with your animal, or what might you do to reduce that? And shut down as well. So We're talking meltdown there, where it seems quite explosive. The shutdown is really the opposite. It's almost like the person goes mute. They disappear. They go from being interactive within a situation to just being there physically. It seems like there's a kind of a checkout there. And again, we'd be looking to map to support systems to really understand how that person is as we end that session. Online, we don't have the luxury of that person being in the room where we can say, "Are you okay?" and we can really check in with them. So we take that into the online setting, and it's just to be, I guess, aware of that. So counsellors working with neurodivergent clients must recognise and adapt to diverse communication preferences when prioritising written communication to support unique session environments if need be. By fostering accommodating and understanding approach, practitioners can significantly improve the therapeutic experience of autistic clients. Adapting to these needs requires flexibility from outsiders, counsellors, sensitivity, and a commitment to the ongoing learning. It's what you're doing right now. By listening to this podcast, you're doing that learning. We've spoken today about the importance of studying to be an online and telephone counsellor or using technology online. Counselling Tutor has a course. It is really not expensive. It's well worth it. It's very, very highly reviewed. Go to counsellingtutor.com. It is there. Over 10,000 counsellors have taken that training because we purposely made it a low price, a reasonably low price compared to other people in the market that were offering it at the time, because we knew there was a need. We introduced that training at the time COVID just hit, and it is still doing really, really well right now. Go to counsellingtutor.com. You can find out about that. If you're interested in taking our Working Therapeutically with Autistic Clients training course, also counsellingtutor.com. You'll get all the information of that. And the handout that we are using today to have this conversation, we always have a super duper handout created by Rory, and we talk through the handout. It's got references in, it's got further reading in, and its learning outcomes will help you recognize communication challenge faced by autistic clients in various modes and understanding why certain methods may be anxiety inducing. You'll identify preferred communication approaches for autistic clients and incorporate these into your practice and enhance therapeutic adaptability. And then it also covers implementing essential risk management practices. You can get the free super duper handout just by going to counsellingtutor.com, click on our podcast tab, find episode 321, and it's right there for you. And that is today's ethical, sustainable practice. And as we move out of ethical, sustainable practice, we head into Practice Matters, the CPD section of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Rory, you've already introduced this beautifully. You reached out, you spoke to Phil Mitchell about counselling boys and men.
I did indeed. It's Phil's second appearance on the podcast, and he has a clear passion for counselling boys and men, and especially I guess boys and men who've been abused by women. It does happen, and it's something that we need to open our eyes to. I caught up with Phil, and he talked about the 2 lectures that he's recorded for our CPD library, and this is what he had to say.
Practice Matters is proudly sponsored by the Counsellor CPD Library. To access top quality, relevant continuing professional development for your practice that you can do at a time that suits you, and all for less than the price of a cup of coffee, visit counsellingtutor.com.
Men's mental health has, for a long time, certainly in my opinion, been maybe forgotten, mainly because probably men are not very good, or should I say are getting better, perhaps at identifying their own emotional and mental issues, but also maybe because the mechanisms that support therapy may not have been very male friendly. So I'm very pleased to welcome back again Phil Mitchell, who's done 2 fabulous lectures in the CPD library, our CPD library, entitled Adapting Your Practice to Work with Men and boys. So Phil Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us again.
Thank you for inviting me back. Thank you.
So the first thing I was struck was that when we ask lecturers to lecture, they usually do one lecture. You did two. So what was it drove you to do your lecture in two parts?
Anyone who knows me knows that when I get going, I can talk for England. And I think when I spoke to Colette originally about the lectures, as you call them, it was Colette that very gently but clearly said, I think maybe there's a lot to cover here and it might be best if they're split in two. And I think her suggestion was, it made sense. But I also think, I can talk and talk and talk. And I think when I was delivering the lectures as well, I had to remember thinking, hang on, there's a time limit here. Phil, come on, shut up. And so I had to rein it in and as I often get told. But I think, there were two, I think, Colette kind of hit the nail on the head. There was the two distinct parts. One was, it feels like I did them ages ago now. One was very much about kind of the issue of how society, government, the media, how they generally treat men and all this sort of anti-male narrative that seems to be everywhere these days. And issues of misandry. So anyone who doesn't know that the hatred, contempt and dislike for men, and prejudice for men, of course, and how that is kind of very much widespread these days. And the second lecture was more about now we understand, or we've got a bit more of an understanding about how these issues are prevalent and how they can affect boys and men. Let's look at, as you say, what we could call male-friendly methods in working with boys and men. And I should say as well, it's not, anyone who's listening to this, it's not so rigidly absolute that you just must work like this with boys and men and you just must work like this with girls and women. We're talking about average differences.
Yes. So it sounds like there's so much to cover. Colette, for those who don't know who Colette is, Colette's our producer. So people who deliver lectures, we have a producer, that's Colette, and they meet up and record them. And I've had a look at the lectures, and there is a lot of material here, Phil. And it sounds only right it was done in two parts. Now, the first part is entitled Misandry and Masculinity.
Yes.
And I just want to kind of touch on that. There is a bit of a debate about misandry. There seems to be two schools of thought about it, that it's a real thing, that women can hate men and may do down men. The other side of it is this is a kind of invented term to protect male privilege. I wonder if you could speak to that, because last time we spoke, we did get quite a few comments in the Facebook group along those lines.
Well, so first of all, it is absolutely not. Depending if you want to go, it's made up, not in the sense that I think you're referring to. Every word that exists at some point was made up from something,
yes.
If we want to go that far. But I think in the way that, it's been dismissed as it's made up, it doesn't exist. It's completely false. It absolutely does exist. It has a very clear definition. And the definition, generally speaking, is it's the attitude. And it's the attitude of the hatred, dislike, contempt, and or prejudice towards men, perhaps you could say because they are men, or that sort of element of it. And so ultimately it's like misogyny to girls and women. We cannot say that one absolutely exists and one doesn't, because one, it makes no sense to say that. You could say they exist differently, that the attitude of misogyny and misandry are prevalent maybe in different ways, but and that they influence different types of behaviour, comments and disadvantage, but that's not the same as saying one definitely exists and one doesn't. And I think what a lot of people do is they look at how they believe misogyny influences certain harm and behaviour, and then they'll say, right, well, there's the issues affecting men, the adversities affecting men, it's not, they're different, so clearly it can't exist. Well, you might as well say, look at how misandry influences behaviour that affects men. we don't see exactly the same parallel for women, so then misogyny doesn't exist. No, there are differences and there are similarities, but just because there are some differences doesn't mean misandry does not exist. And if you look at Steve Moxon's research, which I should say I don't agree with everything in his research, but he's evidenced various points to say that, misandry, here are examples. Here it does exist. It's there and it's blatant. So to say it doesn't exist is just quite simply not true. It does exist. There are people online who declare themselves as being proud misandrists, who say they are proud that they hate men, and their entire online identity is about hatred of men. There are a number of cases where men were killed, tortured, run over, and the perpetrators were saying it was because he was a man. I hate men. I don't think so. There's a clear link there. But the problem that we have, and I might have said this last time we spoke, is that when there is any sort of adversity directed towards or experienced by women, we often assume, and when I say we, I mean society, media, we often assume it is always or often motivated by misogyny. Often, not always, but often without any supporting evidence. But when there is clear adversity directed towards or experienced by men, we never even consider misandry as a potential motivating factor. So you end up with this narrative that says, look at all this horrible stuff happening to men, and because we haven't considered misandry, but we're definitely going to consider against women, whether it is or isn't, you end up with this distorted narrative. So it absolutely exists, and there's a wealth of anecdotal and emerging research saying it clearly does exist. And just to come back to the original point, it's not just about an attitude held by women, other men as well. It's not about whether it's men or women, it's about people, men and women, who have this hatred, contempt for men, and other men also hold this attitude as well. So for me, it's less about whether the holder of the attitude is a man or woman, and it's more about the actual existence of the attitude.
That's an excellent overview of the position of that statement, and it kind of leads me on to why do we need to adjust our practices when working with men and boys? Part of your lecture is about the fact that maybe we need a slightly different mindset when working with men and boys. What changes, or how do we adapt our practices to working with men and boys?
Well, there's the actual application of words, language, and methods in the room, but there's also, before that, my view would be your own views on boys and men. So, boys and men as a demographic, what do you think of them? How do you label them? What general words come to mind when you describe them? And any opinions that you've got, and we're all allowed our opinions, regardless of what they might be. But it's also useful to think, how might your opinion possibly affect your practice with boys and men? So it starts with your own attitudes, and then I think it's more of the stuff that you do in the room. But when you asked, why should we? Well, first of all, I would say it's not that we definitely should. If you're working with boys and men and they engage with you, they come, they talk, they engage in the way, in a useful way, it looks like they're getting something useful out of the sessions, then that would suggest that whatever you're doing is working, and that's fine. If what you're doing is not working and they seem stuck, they seem a bit confused, it looks like they might disengage, then it might be that what could be happening is that you're using methods that are, on average, more attractive to and accessible to girls and women on average, and a little less attractive to boys and men on average. Now, years ago, my opinion, which was very ill-informed, it was a little bit based on experience, based on opinion, but it wasn't based on any research. And I'm a little bit embarrassed I held this opinion, but I used to say the differences between males and females, it's all 100% to do with socialization and how we bring them up. I was totally wrong. Now, it's the nature-nurture argument. Yes, of course, environmental factors, society, media, government, family, upbringing, peers, how we bring people up, the messages we give them, that absolutely plays a part. Of course it does. But that's not the entire story. It doesn't start and end there. It starts in the brain. And there's a wealth of research. And in the last few years, I've, met lots of researchers, psychologists, read huge amounts of literature. The consistent findings are there. And there are average differences, some average differences between the brains of males and the brains of females. And those average differences contribute towards some of the different choices that we make. And what we find is that girls and women, on average, picking my words carefully, you'll notice, on average, prefer an approach that focuses on talking and lots of words and focusing on and expressing emotions. Nothing wrong with that at all. There's nothing wrong with that approach if you use it and it works, regardless if it's a man or a woman. On average, what we see is that boys and men certainly find an approach more accessible and more attractive when it's more solution focused and action orientated and more doing. Now, that doesn't mean you abandon talking. It doesn't mean you abandon empathy. But what it might mean is that you don't solely rely on that and that you add to it. So that could be something quite simple as changing your language. So instead of saying something like, you're asking for help because you're vulnerable and that's okay, you could change that to you're tackling your problems and this is the start of you showing strength. And more men than women on average will find that attractive. And so in terms of why should we do that, is the first question, is because there are average differences between men and women, between males and females, and there's nothing wrong with that. And if you are working with boys and men and you find that they are not engaging in the approach that you might use with girls and women, and find that girls and women are engaging with it, don't expect this boy or man to change to fit with how you're working. Maybe it's about taking a step back, thinking, what can I do to change? And so that's what I did. And as I said to somebody there, when you're in private practice, there are basically two things that you want to achieve from private practice: a positive outcome for your client and profit. They're the two things that you want to achieve from private practice, right? The approach that I have adopted in the last, 10 years or something like that now, where it's what I call a pro-male approach, using masculinity instead of demonizing it, using sort of action-oriented, solution-focused ways of working and language, I've seen that it absolutely works. If it didn't work, I wouldn't do it. Why would I? Sure. I'm trying to run a successful private practice where I can be in profit and the people I'm seeing are achieving something useful. It doesn't work with everybody. Nothing works with everyone. But I've certainly seen a massive difference. So I know it works. And there's emerging literature that's also coming out that says, yes, it can work.
Yeah, I think that one of the things that I picked up in the lecture was some research done, I think, with the Samaritans about the length of time that male callers held on the phone. Mm-hmm. And by using male-centered communication, they got about 7%. I think it was between 25 and 33, so my maths isn't great, but I think that's 7%. It might be 8% thinking about it. But they got an 8% longer engagement with male callers by purposely using male-centered language. Now, the Samaritans a bipartisan organisation that does great work, and if anybody's listening, not in the UK, the Samaritans are a phone service that people in distress or in crisis can phone up, and it's effectively a listening service. I'm sure throughout the world there are different iterations of it, but that statistic is quite striking, isn't it? Just by changing the language and the approach, they got a measurable, better engagement, a longer engagement.
Yeah, it was. I know Martin Seeger, who's a chartered psychologist who's done a lot of work and a lot of research around masculinity, along with John Barry. I think it was Martin Seeger that, I don't know if he headed up the research. If he's listening to this, I want to make sure I'm saying the words right. But he was certainly involved in it. I think he headed it up. I might be wrong, but he was definitely involved in it. And if you just go to Google and type in Martin Seeger, SEAGER, GER, Samaritan's Man Talk, you'll get, it's all there. But I think, again, that again, it's more evidence that says if you do change your language to be more sort of action-orientated, solution-focused, that actually you'll find that men will engage for longer, perhaps even more effectively. And I've certainly found that out in my practice. As I keep saying, if it didn't work, I wouldn't keep using it. Why would I?
Yes.
I'm not going to be as successful as that. I'm not going to help clients achieve their outcomes. I'm not going to be in profit, But not only is there evidence like the Samaritan's Man Talk project, but there's anecdotes from mine and people I supervise who work with a lot of boys and men. They're saying the same thing. So, and I think over the next few years, there's going to be more research coming out that kind of supports the statement that actually this way of working can be very useful and attractive to boys and men engaging in therapy.
Yes, I think that's interesting. And we're talking about primarily, or you were talking about primarily working with clients in session. But also I think there's an added dimension to this in that if you are a private practitioner and you're messaging on your website or your listing by using male-friendly language, I'm going to use the term male-friendly language.
Yeah.
You might very well attract more male clients.
Yes.
And you give an example of that in the lecture that you, by changing the wording, it's more attractive. It's basic marketing, isn't it? Marketers have known this for years. Anybody that's at a marketing meeting would know that if you want to attract certain clients, use certain kinds of language. And it would seem that could, this idea of male affirming language, I'd use that term, could be used as a way of increasing the amount of male clients you get into your practice.
Yep. And I like I said, I think on the part 2 of the part 2 lecture, I think I mentioned that where I gave an example. It was a sort of mock-up of a sort of website. But yeah, when my website years ago was very, come to therapy, express your emotions. It's okay to be vulnerable, all of that, those sorts of words. And again, there's nothing wrong with that, but I was working with nowhere near as many men as I am now. And when I changed the language to things like tackle your problems, take control, words to that effect, I saw a massive, and I mean like massive, noticeably massive increase in men getting in touch for therapy. And some women as well who said they liked that approach because they hadn't seen it from other therapists and that's what they wanted. But I certainly saw more men getting in touch going, I like that. We're not just sitting and talking, are we? And I would say, well, I'm probably not just sitting and talking with anybody. But I think that what a lot of the men were saying is when it's sit there and it's empathic reflections and nodding and validation and the core conditions and all that, nothing wrong with that at all. But a lot of men were saying, I don't want just that. And that's what I think counselling is. And that's what I've had in the past. And so you can explain different types of counselling approaches and all of that. But sometimes with some clients, it can be useful to, where relevant and appropriate, of course, to highlight what you might call male-friendly methods. And I think on my profiles, I've put that the British Psychological Society in November 2022, they released a briefing paper addressing this, backing up everything I'm saying. And if you are going to work with male clients, here is what we find is useful. And it talks about things saying, abandon language like toxic masculinity because it's not helpful. Take a positive approach of masculinity and all of this sort of stuff. And it talks about solution-focused approaches, action-orientated language. So it's kind of supported by the BPS. And there's more and more evidence coming out year on year showing that this can work. But as I said, I saw a massive increase in men getting in touch, and straight away I thought, wow, if this is attracting them to practice because of what they're seeing, then we can use this in the room. And we did, and I've seen that it generally works quite well. Yeah,
I mean, I would say from my own practice experience, when I was practicing, there's a couple of things that triggered men coming to therapy. One was any national coverage of males being abused by another man or being abused in general. And I can remember when there was a football coach who was convicted of grooming and abusing young boys. And when that came into the media in the trial, my phone rang off the hook.
Yeah.
It rang off the hook. But what was quite interesting was the men I work with, not all of them, I have to say not all of them, but I would say a good majority wanted more action-based. They wanted the session. They wanted some takeaways for the session. They wanted things they could do. And in a person-centered way, what I did was say, well, what kind of things do you think you could do? And usually by them actually having the freedom to speak out about what they could do, and that being affirmed. I mean, I didn't say yes you should or no you shouldn't, but having that forum and that space to do that, they took that away, and it's unfortunate because of confidentiality I can't share some of the things, but what I can say, perhaps one of the most surprising ones was a number of men taking control of being able to say no to intimacy and sex if it was demanded of them. I'll leave it there because I don't want to go too far into something that could break confidentiality. Yeah. That would seem to, I think, to a lot of people, maybe it's just me, but maybe surprising, given the stereotype of men.
I think that's the thing, I think it's a rigid, oversimplified, men always want sex and never say no to sex. Absolute rubbish. That is complete. Yes, there might be, if we think about that, men on average, according to years of research, men on average think about sex more than women on average. Statistically and from research, that's true. But that's not the same as the over-exaggerated statement of men always think about sex and will never say no. No, completely rubbish. And I, there's plenty of examples anecdotally I could share, and it's that, hang on a minute, there's some men will think, I don't want to have sex, but I should say yes because he or she will think I'm less of a man. What will that mean? And then you can explore what it means to be a man. And it might be, strength and being in control. And actually, maybe you might feel more strength and more in control if you assertively put your needs across and go, I'm not in the mood right now, so please respect that. Yeah. And that's the thing. It's like, oh, okay. So what you do is you do the reframe, and that's using elements of what Martin Seeger and John Barry call archetypal masculinity to kind of reframe their experiences. I'm not a real man. Well, what does it mean to be a real man? But you could also say, well, you're using your masculinity to take control of this situation.
Absolutely. So what do you hope that people will take away from watching these two lectures?
That's a good question. Well, first of all, I hope that they will. I mean, some people won't because they just, some people are firmly hold on to their beliefs. But I hope that some people will be more open to the existence and prevalence of misandry. I hope that they'll be open to accepting that it is held and displayed by women and men, that it can and does influence all manner of behaviour towards men, from horrible words online to horrific, violent and terrible abuse. I hope that they'll be more open to that because, as you said, we see misogyny everywhere and we never really talk about misandry. And so there's that. I hope that they will also consider that they could explore adapting their practice with boys and men who perhaps might be struggling to engage with them or not feeling comfortable engaging with them when they're using certain methods that are more what you might call traditional therapy and less generally male-friendly. So I guess they're the things I hope that people would take. And ultimately, that masculinity as a concept, maybe not a concept, that's the wrong word, but that masculinity as an aspect of humanity is not bad, is not toxic, is not horrible, and is not something that should be viewed with caution or suspicion or anything. And that actually, if we look at archetypal masculinity, that it can actually be used as a really great resource to help people achieve some of the things they want to achieve.
Well, adapting your practice to work with men and boys, a 2-part lecture, is available in the CPD library. And it just goes for me to say, Phil Mitchell, thank you so much for joining us.
Massive thank you to Phil Mitchell. Thank you to you, Rory, for reaching out, holding those all-important discussions. That was Practice Matters. We now head right into Student Services. Student Services is sponsored by Counselling Skills Academy. Can't tell you how many times Rory and I have heard counselling students say that learning skills and knowing that they're using them effectively is really, really challenging. The reason for this is because we don't get to see another counsellor using skills in a real live session. In reality, this means that we're asked to learn something that we can never see demonstrated in a real setting, and it's no wonder that many of us are left feeling unsure. If you want to see counselling skills used in real sessions by qualified therapists, so this is real sessions, real presentations, and real use of skills, then go to counselingskillsacademy.com. There's some free videos on skills, including a full live session that you can have a look at. Gain the competence and the confidence of knowing you're using your counselling skills effectively. Just visit counselingskillsacademy.com. And today in Student Services, managing boundaries, Rory. Wow, this is an evergreen topic if ever I've heard one, not just in training, post-training too. Boundaries, boundaries, boundaries. My goodness, the amount of times we come back to boundaries.
Yes, indeed. And I think sometimes that even the term boundaries for people who are just coming into counselling may be a word they've never come across. Certainly it wasn't a word that I understood too well when I trained many years ago. And effectively, boundaries are a way of protecting yourself and the person that you're working with. And I'll give you an example of that, I think, is that, students who doing maybe an introduction course may work with peers who talk about very personal details in their lives. And, I think all good trainers talk about what confidentiality is and things that are shared mustn't be shared outside. But sometimes I think that people's boundaries become a bit blurred. And, I've known of cases where students have listened to someone's issue and then maybe discussed it in another place. Now, that's a very blurred boundary. Someone tells you something, you have to keep the confidence. And, by sharing it with someone else, that's clearly a boundary issue. But I think probably the biggest boundary challenge that those in training face, certainly those who are maybe moving up from certificate to diploma, is being compelled to act as informal counsellors for friends and family. I think as soon as I mentioned that I was doing counselling, I had a parade of people who came to my door who started off their conversation with me as, "I believe you're training to be a counsellor." Well, and I had to go, "Yes, I am. And maybe if you've got issues, you should see a counsellor." But those boundaries can be pretty blurred. And in our Facebook page, and certainly in conversations with colleagues and students and peers through the years, it seems to be one of the biggest challenges that switching off your kind of counselling skills and counselling thinking and persona when you're with friends and family. You are brothers, sisters, uncles, mothers, aunties, whatever, not their therapist.
Yeah, like it. So for me, boundaries don't get blurred. I know they do in the real world. So I'm talking just for me now. I've got a very specific picture in my head of what a boundary is. I'm going to share it with you. So when we moved into our house in North Wales, we had a boundary dispute with somebody who owned land right next to us. And they said, that piece over there is our land. And we looked at our deeds and we looked at the maps that come from the offices that be. And we said, no, the ordnance survey shows this is our piece of land. And we could go to court. We didn't need to. Eventually it was resolved and they went, yeah, okay, it's your piece of land. How? Because we had a boundary that was drawn. It was drawn on a map many years ago. The home that I live in is over 200 years old. But boundaries are fixed. They're in place, and they're in place for a reason. So here's a question. If somebody If you were sat there having your dinner in your home, listening to this, you're sat at home, you're having your dinner, and suddenly somebody walked out of your bathroom, across your lounge, and said, "Thank you, I'm on my way now," and left your house because somebody came in and they just wanted to use your bathroom. That is a very clear breach of your boundaries. They've come into your house, which has got boundaries and a door. They've opened that up. They've come in and they've used one of your facilities and left. How would you feel about that? Well, it's just not done. It's a boundary. We don't do that. You don't go past, if your door was on the street, you don't go past the street. You don't go inside. That's where the boundary lies. So a boundary is a fixed thing. It doesn't move. It's not like it's not elastic. It doesn't bend. Boundary for me is solid. It is there. It is a rule. You can see my neurodivergence coming out here, Rory. My autism. I love my rules. I love my rules. That boundary is in place. So for me, once a boundary has been put in place, let's say I'm just gonna use a hypothetical example here. Let's say the boundary is that our counselling session starts at 5 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. And at 5:15, the client arrives. Well, the boundary was set and was agreed, and that's the other thing about boundaries. They have to be agreed. We don't just set boundaries up ourselves. I don't just sit there deciding things and not telling anyone. A boundary is agreed upon by both parties, and that's done at contracting and in our initial session. So we've got this agreed boundary that our counselling session is from 5 o'clock to 6 o'clock on a Thursday afternoon. When the client arrives at 5:15 at 5 or late, that boundary has been broken. I can be understanding about the fact that they were caught in traffic. I really can. But what I might do is revisit the boundary with that person. It depends on the reason of why they're late. So if they were caught in traffic, it's very, very understandable. And I might suggest something like, if it is at all possible in the future, if you see you're going to be late and you're in traffic, I wonder if you wouldn't mind just pulling over to the side and just send me a quick message so that I'm aware of that, so that I can have that knowledge as well. So I would look to replace that boundary. I don't believe that they move or are elastic. So that's just an interesting one of how I see the boundary. I actually see it in my head as a physical thing. So confidentiality is a boundary. Confidentiality is a boundary with a few gates in it. So we can't go through the boundary of confidentiality. What you're telling me as my client, I am holding that. I'm not going to share that with anyone, except, let me put some gates in there. I will be taking it to clinical supervision. If you indicate any of the contracted reasons that I might break confidentiality, I will need to speak to somebody. If the coroner contacts me, I would need to share that information. If a court of law issued a demand for that information, I would have to do it. So I've got this wall and I've got little gates in that are the reasons why that boundary would be breached or when we would go past that boundary. But other than that, I got my wall in place, and and this client have got the wall in place, and there's safety. And I think that's what a boundary's for. They keep the relationship a safe place to be. Within boundaries, everybody knows where they are. They know how far they can go within that space comfortably. It is agreed on, and it holds that space. It holds it as that comfortable, safe space where we share the client's journey and their information. Outside of those boundaries, it's a scary place for me outside those boundaries, Rory, and I guess it might be scary for a client as well, not knowing if what they speak to you about is confidential. Who might you be telling? Are you telling your friend or your partner? Are you going into college and discussing your client work with other students? I had a client who. It's interesting, isn't it?
It is. And many years ago, there was a blog that I followed relentlessly called Stories of a Boundary Ninja.
I like it.
A boundary ninja. And it was a therapist, I presume a female therapist. I can't be sure because it was anonymous, but I got from the tone of the writing and other other aspects of the information shared, that it was a female client, female therapist. And she talked about dancing on the edges of boundaries. And while I agree with you to some extent that some boundaries are fixed, such as things like confidentiality, not meeting your clients in the pub for a drink, I think there are some areas where we need to be a boundary ninja. We need to dance on the edge of the boundaries. And to do that, we need support from our supervisor. And also we need to be very introspective about ourselves. And I'll give you an example of that. You get a client who comes 15 minutes late for their session. And as Ken outlined, you say, well, look, we're going to have to recontract for that. What happens if this client is neurodivergent and has ADHD? Or ADH, as we dropping the disorder on the podcast from now on. We know ADH has ADH, and they say, "Look, I just can't help it. I try my best to get here on time, but I'm just late." What do you do in that situation? And I think that's where sometimes being the boundary ninja would allow you a little bit of flexibility to say, okay, what do we do in this situation? And sit with the clients. And if it was me, and I'm not suggesting people take my advice on this, and I will certainly speak to my supervisor, but I might say, look, what I'm going to do is, you obviously struggle with time and you need obviously you want an hour session. What I might do is diarize 1.25 hours for my clients. And I might say to them, what the session will be one. There's no rules to say the session has to be an hour. There's nothing written down in the laws of counselling that says it be an hour. I might say, look, what I'm going to do is I'm going to diarize 1.25 hours. Your appointment's at 4:00 on Thursday the 8th. And, I know you struggle with time. If you're a little late, then we can roll round. That's recontracting the boundary. So I think there are certain times when you have to be a bit of a boundary ninja, but it has to be done, I think, with experience and also really good supervision. And also if you're a student, and this section is predominantly listened to by students, speaking with your tutor, but we just have to be, I think sometimes we have to be boundary ninjas, but there are some that are fixed. So from my perspective, I wouldn't socialize with clients unless, of course, I went to a party, which is very unlike me. I don't go to parties. But what happens if I go to a party and my client stood there as a guest? What do you do? So sometimes you have to be a bit of a boundary ninja, and you have to kind of adapt yourself to the situation. However, like a compass that always guides you back to the direction you're going on, you should always have a kind of ethical, moral compass, that you could justify to peers and to your tutor and also to your supervisor. So I'm not sure if that blog is still around. I'm sure there'll be people furiously searching for stories of a boundary ninja, but it actually changed. Honestly, isn't it just a great name? I wish I'd have invented it. And if that person's listening, get in contact. I'd love to interview you. But I think that I think it's all about how we interact and build our relationship with clients. But to agree with Ken, there are some things that are quite fixed, but sometimes being a boundary ninja. And I like the idea of dressing up in black and carrying a samurai sword, to be honest, Ken.
Yes, I can well imagine you do, Rory.
Yeah,
we do not recommend anybody try this at home or in
don't
practice.
do that in session.
So I'm going to see your boundary ninja and going to raise you a reasonable adjustment. Watch I've got the old poker talk. I've never played a game of poker in my life. So if we look at what boundaries are, they are agreed. They are agreed kind of rules around the counselling session. They can be renegotiated. That is different to breaking a boundary. They can be renegotiated. Now, we've got our first session recently on the Counselling Tutor Podcast is Ethical Sustainable Practice, where we're speaking about neurodivergence. And within that, if you've been following the podcast, we speak a lot about reasonable adjustments. And reasonable adjustments are almost like moving the boundaries in certain areas for a very good reason. But when we move those boundaries, we move them because of that good reason, because we've identified that boundaries might need moving. So, for instance, I'm not going to put in a for instance. I'm sure you can imagine what I mean by that. We're going to move those with the consent and with discussion with our clients. Boundaries can be moved within counselling as well. So, if a boundary is broken and we go back and we go, you know what, we really need to have a look at this again. Let's just rediscuss this time frame. And the person might say, you know what, like you're saying, Rory, I just can't get there for 5 o'clock. Sometimes the buses are late. Sometimes the rush hour traffic is there. And I never considered that. And I've tried to move my appointment with you, but you can't because you're fully booked counsellor. Then we might look around. Can we make it a 45-minute session, leaving that little bit of time for them to come? Can I afford a 15 minutes after they would maybe have left to be able to accommodate that? So we're trying to accommodate. And then we readjust those boundaries. We recontract around those boundaries. And once again, Ken's at peace, following the rules. There's my neurodivergence. When I'm outside the rules, I don't feel so good. But you're 100% right, Rory. There's times when we need to look at those boundaries and relook at them. And then the meeting somebody outside of counselling, I think that's a really good example. And it's certainly happened to me. And I was very grateful to have a supervisor when I worked with my boundaries and I worked with my initial contracting with a client. We looked at this. What would happen if I saw you or met you outside of the therapy room? And it's put into was at the time when I was in practice, was put into my contract. And I would say something along the lines of, if I should see you outside of our therapy environment, like walking down the street, or we just end up at the same event together, I will not acknowledge you. I won't come up to you. I won't wave and say hello, but you are more than welcome to come over to me and say hello. And the reason for that is I wouldn't want to go up to that person and go, oh, hello, I see we're at the same event. And for somebody in their party to say, oh, who was that? Leaving them either saying, that's my counsellor and maybe divulging they're in therapy, or in a position where they might have to lie and make up that it's somebody else. So, and let's say that I didn't have that within my contract. Let's say I hadn't spoken about any contact outside the therapy room and I ended up at a engagement and that client was there. I think that's where, as therapists, we can go, aha, there's a situation that I didn't anticipate. Here it is. It's just happened. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to go back to my contract. I'm going to go back to my boundaries. How can I make it to minimize that happening again? Or if it does happen again, mitigating any embarrassment for the client, embarrassment for me, or whatever that situation may be. And this is why when we introduced this topic as being in student services, I suggested that boundaries are that they go with you throughout your entire counselling career. I was forever revisiting my own boundaries and contracts and just adapting it as my practice and my clients taught me areas that I needed to, I guess, firm up. So that's boundaries as an overview from me, Rory. Any final thoughts on boundaries?
Yeah, I think that boundaries, if you're practicing, if you're a student in your practice time, doing your 100 hours or how many hours you have to accrue, I think it's something to put on the agenda for supervision. I think it's always, learning to be a therapist, I think, is a bit like learning to drive. It's just that you don't have the instructor sat next to you when you're in the when you're in the driving seat. And I think it's useful to chat about boundaries. And I think it's one of the things that, in my experience, a lot of people have shame about. So, I've certainly supervised people who've said, "You never guess what's happened." Well, what's happened? Well, I was I was out shopping and I bumped into my client and they started talking to me and I talked to them. And it's like, okay, and I don't know if I've crossed the boundary. And I think encouraging conversations about boundaries, certainly as a supervisor, I'd encourage conversations. And, these things happen. We live in a real world. And sometimes, I can remember many years ago getting some bird seed at a local shop, and I was stood in the queue. Next, the person in front of me was a former client. And behind me was my wife with some more shopping, and this person was chatting away to me, and I'm trying to keep it like, oh, bird seed, and and eventually we got outside, and my wife said, "I don't ask about that person, do I?" And I said, "Probably not," and we never talked about it because she got the sense that this person was my client. I never said that. But and it's a long time ago now, so if my wife's listening, she probably knew anyway. But she probably knew anyway. But I think it's one of those things where having a good conversation with your partner about, you might be approached by strange people who ask you questions, and that might be part of it. Is a part of a boundary, because can you imagine being in that situation and my wife saying, "Well, who was that? Who was that? Who's that you're talking to?" It becomes very difficult. That's a boundary. So I think it's about setting your stall out, but speak about it in supervision. Yes. Try to, you should stick to boundaries, and they're there to protect the client and indeed yourself. So that's my final thoughts on it.
Thank you. Yes. That's what they are there for, really, at the end of the day. In the same way as the boundaries of your house, the walls of your house are there to protect you from the elements and the weather. It's the same. The boundaries in counselling protect you as a counsellor. They protect you in the event of a complaint. They really do. If you were within your boundaries and they were clearly laid out. And, of course, they protect the client within the sanctity, dare I use the word, of counselling in the session. Well, there it is. That is Student Services for this week, and we're so glad that you joined us. This has been episode 321 of the Counselling Tutor Podcast. The National Counselling and Psychotherapy Society, or NCPS, proudly sponsor this podcast, supporting students every step of the way. Join the NCPS for resources, training, and a friendly, knowledgeable community to enhance your learning experience. Visit ncps.com.
Yes, we started off with effective online counselling for neurodivergent clients, best practices, where we talked about being thoughtful and maybe adapting your practice to work with neurodivergent or autistic clients, especially when you work online, the focus of online work. In Practice Matters, we had an interview with Phil Mitchell on a topic of counselling boys and men. He's done 2 lectures for the Counsellor CPD Library on that, and I have watched them. I have to say, they're absolutely fabulous, and shines the light into an area and a client group that is sometimes overlooked. And in Student Services, Ken and myself were boundary ninjas, talking about managing boundaries and the importance of having boundaries and how they may be crossed. As always, we always enjoy seeing really nice reviews on either social media or on the podcast platform. And for those who've left them, thank you so much. It means so much. And if you've liked this episode, why don't you share it with your peers or fellow students or fellow professionals so that they could hear our conversations and maybe gain some insight from them. And as always, stay grounded and stay safe.
Take the stress out of your counselling studies and get the support of Rory and I by joining us in the Counselling Study Resource. Counselling Study Resource, or CSR for short, is the world's most comprehensive assignment guidance and study support resource for students just like you of counselling and psychotherapy. See how Counselling Study Resource can help you. Visit counsellingtutor.com. That's counsellingtutor.com.
Thank you for listening to the Counselling Tutor Podcast. Find the show notes for this episode by visiting counsellingtutor.com.